Welcome. It gives me great pleasure to introduce another conversation on salt. And this time we're looking at salt's impact in education and art. A conversation with Professor Supriya Nair and Wendell Manwarren. Wendell has developed as an actor, singer, songwriter, band leader, sound designer, director, producer, writer, teacher, mentor, and inveigler. I like that one. And Professor Supriya is a professor in the Department of English Language and Literature at the University of Michigan. So thank you so much for being here. And I want to wish you a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica.
Thank you, Erica.
Greetings, Supriya.
Greetings. Good to see you.
Yeah, likewise. It's good little exchange we've had via email has been very enticing. So looking forward to this evening's conversation.
Thank you.
So as I indicated in our email exchange, I prepared to take your lead and respond as best as I can, from my position as a practitioner and keen appreciator of Earl Loveless as a writer and storyteller.
So I have written on salt before, and as I was mentioning to you, Wendell, before this event went live, I met him when I was in New Orleans, teaching in New Orleans at Tulane University, many years ago. It was a real pleasure, and it gives me great joy to go back to his work, and also to revisit that article that came out many years ago, and revisit some issues that I feel, I've been thinking further about. And I'd be curious to hear your perspective about what's going on in Trinidad right now. It's not like salt is dated. There are so many things he's saying that still resonate.
Not in the least, still very resonant.
Yeah.
Still very pertinent.
Yeah. And I thought, as I told you, in our conversations over email, that one of the things I'd like to think about a little more is the trope that he uses, with which he begins the novel, which is the trope of the flying Africans.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious also to enter into conversation about this, because teaching from the US, it's when we talk about a canon of Caribbean literature in the syllabus, it's usually dominated by writers who left the Caribbean and are no longer living in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
And so I thought it interesting that he begins with the critique of flight, even though the trope of the flying Africans actually has very liberatory resonances for Caribbean literature. It's, all over the place now, even in criticism. It's interesting that he begins with the critique of Alfred George also wanting to leave the Caribbean. Mm-hmm. And this is no way to criticize those who do leave. Mm-hmm. We all have choices to make. So I was curious, why it is that in some ways Loveless insists on looking at who stays in Trinidad, because he's such a Trinidadian writer, even though he has, he has things to say about the Caribbean, and clearly he has a universal audience. What is it about that insistence on a Trinidadian location? The rhythms, the cadences, the lives there that matter so much.
Yeah. Well, the sweetness that is Trinidad, the intrigue that is Trinidad, the puzzle that is Trinidad, the juxtaposition of ideas and peoples and cultures and vibrations and rhythms and skin tones and skin colors and food and textures and tastes, the landscape. There's a lot to intrigue and delight and to hook you, to want to root you. And that idea of the trope of the flying African is, in a sense, like at the root of all tropes is a certain perennial truth of an idea, of a storytelling motif, a symbol, and as a storyteller, a contemporary storyteller, I like when I bounce these things up and when they're well deployed. So in this instance, the way the tight sentences that describe how he just stuck these corn cobs under his arms and took flight in his black coat, and the response from the crowd below it, they see usual, black people, children had to suffer because nobody take time to pass things on to them. So much is explored in that. The idea that magically someone could take flight, and that's not the issue that's being discussed. The issue that's being discussed is that he go on and he leave we and he ain't tell we the secrets, So the cursing, not the awe and the wonder of it taking flight, and the idea that the reason we've lost that facility for flight is because we eat the salt of the land. That's what binds us to this land. My first version of that flying story is Gangang Sarah's story of a woman, a witch, that flew from Africa to Tobago, drifted from Africa to Tobago, ate salt, and could not fly back to Africa. So it's almost like a reverse of the story. But the thing is that it's a storytelling device, it's a powerful symbol, and it's one that we still could play with and grapple with and try to understand from now till, because it still resonates. And in many ways, you ask about why he chooses, to operate from here. I think that's a big part of his resonance for me, as someone who's also chosen to operate from here, as someone who also at point in time in your development, it was understood that, well, you're going to be going somewhere else, you're too good for here, or, you could be on Broadway, you could be on the West End, or you could be, and I guess because I chose mass and music of carnival and stuff, this is where it happens. So I didn't see the need to operate anywhere else. But in a sense, you could almost sense the disappointment of people who, you went to a good school. How come you didn't go to NYU, which I thought I would do at some point in time, but couldn't afford it. But I didn't get bitter about that. I just stay here and start to work. And there was a value in doing that. So Earl, for me, symbolizes someone who's been able to do that and attain world renown to a degree in his chosen field as a writer. Likewise, working with Peter Minshall, he was also able to do that from right here. At one point, Derek Walter tried to, and then, famously said, "To hell with them, I gone," in Schooner's Flight. But having worked with Derek Walker too, I understand why, he had to go, because here could mash you up, here could really disappoint you, here could set you up. And it plays out in our literature time and again, especially our old favorite sourpuss, Naipaul, who I love his writing. First time I read Miguel Street, I was intrigued beyond, but his bitterness and his hurt comes across, and I think most people could identify with it to a degree. I mean, not to the degree that he goes on sometimes in his interviews and his shenanigans, but in his writing, he's expressing a yearning and a hope and a desire that many people still have to this day.
Yeah. In fact, I find Naipaul's early writing, actually has quite a lot of affection for Trinidad and actually embodies the Trinidadian humor that comes so much to life in Loveless. I mean, one thing I hope, we can emphasize is Lovelace's sense of humor.
Oh,
He's
yeah.
hilarious,
He's
even the time when the minister chokes on something and dies, he makes it so funny.
On the fishbone.
And to me, that embodies such a mischievous Trini sense of humor, which is crucial, because it's not all about suffering and pain and, carrying the burdens of a past. It's also about, a certain kind of riotous enjoyment that you find in his prose, the way it just rushes along with a kind of joyous abandon, an entire sentence that goes on for a paragraph.
I remember trying to read
that life.
I remember trying to read a passage from Dragon one time where he's talking about Pan, and the fella is standing up on the swag and the this and that, and reading it and then realize, but this thing is not stopping. It's just going on relentlessly. It's going on and enjoying being able to go on and capture his cadence. Yeah, that spirit, that fun, that sense of humor, many would say it's been one of our coping mechanisms, as a response to the horror, the trauma of our history, of our past. As a consequence, some will say, well, it's gotten to the point where it's getting in the way of dealing with real things sometimes. But yeah, the fact that he is able to capture that, Earl in particular, when he talks about women with their melodious backsides and not being able to be constrained by, the powers that be, much less the men in their lives. There's a delight and a joy in the music, in the language. When he goes on that long descriptive passage of the many dances that the black people would engage in, to the chagrin of the poor white people in all their armor and sweating and perspiring and trying to keep order in this place where no order was possible. You have to see the humor in it. I totally see the humor in it.
Yeah, and the thing too, it comes out in the characterizations, which I also found in Naipaul. I find it in Sam Selvin. I find it in a number of Caribbean writers, but particularly, when I think in the context of Trinidad, the characters come alive. And when I use the word eccentric, I don't mean to say mad, crazy, or anything like that, but just they're so unique, that you burst out laughing sometimes at their various reactions, not to dismiss them, but they have such a kind of whimsical attitude as well that you have to embrace and you have to enjoy.
The place is full of characters, and has always been full of characters. And, the isle is full of noises, 1,000 twanging instruments. The life is lived large and vivid in many regards. And, at one point you think, is he parodying these people? It's hard to parody something that's already so up in the air. We comment on that whole idea of us playing mass and playing a masquerade culture and a masquerade people. And, a lot of our carnival characters are full of what we call swag and bravedage and braggadocio, and they're archetypes that play out in real life. And a lot of those characters that present themselves for office, those are not parodies when our writers write about them. In many ways, they're playing them down. It's jokey. And in many ways, there's a quality to life that is kind of jokey and performative. Yes. That a good writer can capture, and you could delight in and still see the sadness in it.
Yes, absolutely. Because as I said, it's not as if one wants to dismiss it. And you're absolutely right about the risk of parody. And when we talk about Carnival later, I hope we can get to his sense of a certain risk of performance activism, right? Performative activism, as they call it here, which is, it's all show. It's a pappy show, as one of the characters tells him, you need to get down to serious brass tacks here. There's work to be done. So certainly I want to get to that there, but I just want to go back to the notion of swag and flight, because when you said you were familiar with that story about the witch who flew from Africa, I was thinking of Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, which has a similar sense of the men flying away and leaving the women and children behind. And so there's the sense of not just flight, but abandonment and the breakdown of family, and so it's interesting that in this particular case, Alfred George ultimately comes to a realization. You remember when that child who's not really a very good student, and he's so frustrated because he's like, you're not going to win the college exhibition anyway. Why do you want an education? And he says, I want an education in order to learn. And then it occurs to him, gosh, we don't have to be teaching them in order for them to leave the island. We need to teach them in order for them to live on the island.
Well, yeah, exactly. What's the check the contents of the education system. What are we educating our children towards? And is this a colonial inheritance that we have not taken pains to examine and determine a way forward for ourselves? And I remember as a young man growing up having really intense political arguments with my father, because he was devoted to Dr. Eric Williams for one simple reason: he gave free education. And I was like, so what? He gave free education. As a beneficiary of that free education, I didn't see the big deal to be beholden to somebody like that. But then when you get into my father's story, he was able to pass for one of the more prestigious high schools and couldn't afford it and didn't go to high school. So becoming a Varicolians represented something that for him was, a huge, momentous liberatory act, giving everybody education. I come in after that, post-independence, never been no colonial. It was easy to just assume, well, but that was what he had to do, give everybody education. But even at that point, we were studying, well, what was the content of the education that we were receiving? And it's only after leaving school you realize, I really don't know nothing about me, except for my living reality, and growing up in a very culturally strong community and rooted in mass and pan and that kind of expression, but not in the monolith that is prescribed sometimes as this sort of bottom of the rung expression. We were somewhere, holding on to a few rungs down from the bottom. But my grandfather had a pan yard in his yard. My uncle was a pan man. My father played mass. So there was that whole education that was happening in that Belmont community. But going to this school where it was like, we were the last to learn Latin for a little spell, But the history, there was no history. We were taught about the Arabs and the Arawaks, and then in Form 1 and 2, and then after that, there was no history. So if you're interested in who you are after that, you have to go and find out. And thank God for novelists and storytellers and calypso writers and whatnot. If you're interested enough and curious enough, you can start rediscovering a lot of those missing elements of self. And Loveless has been fundamental in being able to capture that and represent that.
Yes. And in fact, you're picking up on, I think, a really, really crucial theme in the novel. And I'm actually going to go to a particular page in the novel for that. Because when you think of George's education and what he's reading and how he tries, he put pebbles in his mouth, he tries to mimic the BBC accent, he's reading the Oxford Dictionary, he's coming up with all these extremely highfalutin language that doesn't really work there. He's ashamed of Creole. He's trying to wipe that out of his own speech. I mean, he's doing everything he can to erase his own self, as you put it, right?
Yeah.
So there's one sense of formal education, which is social mobility, and perhaps even flight, right? But there's another sense of education, which is, as you're pointing out, self-recognition, self-awareness. Who am I? And I keep thinking of that line in Dragon Can't Dance, right? We are because we is. That sense of Black existence that's coming out there. It's a little more complicated here, of course, when you think of the multiple races that live there. But he says to Florence, what we need to counteract the 300-400 years of colonial propaganda is a tourism thrust of our own. We need to look at ourselves afresh. We need to look at ourselves with a new curiosity. The truth is that we do not know who we are, and we will never know until we see ourselves with new eyes. And so I'm curious about the sense of new eyes.
Well, yeah, that's something he picked up on in It's Just a Movie. One of the speeches for the new party was, the ability to see ourselves with new eyes, to know how many species of birds we have and how many species of butterflies and all these other things. And then he asked some very fundamental questions. What is life? What is a good life? What is the basis of land distribution? And I was really struck by that list of questions and the whole idea of looking at yourself with new eyes, because in many ways it's what I decided to do as an artist many years ago, prompted by that positioning in those forms that I am because we is in the mass, in the pan, in the Belmont community. That was there in me. And then I went to this prestige school where, you were the last to learn Latin, and it was all about advancement and holding on and moving up the rungs of the ladder. But there's nothing to reinforce a certain aspect of who you are. This living reality is not being reinforced in my school reality, And I know that I'm being programmed to get out of here. That was what it was. That school that I went to, if you didn't, if your ambition wasn't to get out of here, something was wrong with you. So in many ways, I rebelled against that, I challenged that. My poor mother and father, much to chagrin and disappointment, and eventual coming around and saying, well, you turned out all right, you didn't come asking for $5 every month or something. So to be able to do whatever you imagine you're capable of doing from right here is still a big issue, still a big challenge in many regards, and for it to be recognized. And that's why for me, Loveless himself is so resonant, and the idea of him challenging the education system. And this is the chapter in Salt where Alfred is dealing with all the issues around the education, is becoming a madman.
Yeah.
He had to go mad for the reality of the space to reveal itself onto him in terms of the education. When he says, look at this dot, you see this dot right here? That is we. Then we start from there, and then we expand from there. So it's like flipping the way of seeing, right? Not that, all is nothing, like the Napoleon view. Nothing ever came from here, nothing can come from here. No, Loveless says, look at how much thing come from here. Look at how much mass and pan and carnival, and people say, all you can talk about is mass and pan and carnival. Well, I do subscribe to that because I come from that. So look, the man is affirming me. I could say, hey, let me walk in my tall, hot beauty, because the story is there to back it up,
Yeah.
So,
Speaking of the trope of the flying African, as a someone who teaches literature, I'm very interested, of course, in the kinds of symbols that appear. And one is the moment that you are describing when he becomes the madman is when he goes home and discovers that the bird in the cage is dead. And it becomes heavily symbolic, of course, of the trapped bird in the cage. But then I also want to get to this whole, metaphor of the dog. I remember when I was visiting, there was a conference at the University of Miami, and Professor Sandra Pouchet-Paclet was there. She's retired now. But she mentioned that actually quite a few, and I think Trinidadian writers in particular, tend to refer to this island as a dot. Not just Naipaul, because I felt that he was making fun of Naipaul, because Naipaul is very much somebody who participates in that sense of the island as too fragile, as too small, as not really connected to the world. Whereas what Loveless is saying is, and Alfred recognizes, is we don't need to go to the world is right here.
Well, Sarah say we don't have to try to be modern people. We are. This is where modern people start, right here.
Yes.
And we've been expressing ourselves as modern people long time. So it's really about flipping it, and as I say, there's something to be learned in the extreme Napoleon view that continues to inform us to this day. There's still many people who believe that this is a place to escape from. And I know many people who, had they not escaped from this place, they wouldn't have been able to attain a smidgen of their dreams, because this space couldn't accommodate what they were trying to accomplish in some regards. Still hasn't for many people. You're not going to be denied that, that reality is there. But commensurate with that was the emergence of a consciousness that said, here is here, and I am because we is, and this is enough, and we are enough for ourselves, and we live in the world, we operate in the world, One of the first times I actually interacted with Earl as a face-to-face as a human being, apart from admiring him as a writer, was in Hamburg, Germany. We were on an international project, and it was an absolute honor for me to be alongside Earl Loveless. And it was just around the time that, Salt had been published, and we actually have a song called Salt, and I was trying to think, was it consciously informed by Salt? No, Salt. Then I look back and I had a little tracing of the actual cover. So yes, there was something happening there, having read elements of Salt and bringing that down to a song that says nothing for you and you like it, speaking to people and saying, here's an opportunity to exercise your franchise, but here you are just throwing it away without any kind of thinking, just because you're from this tribe or you're from that tribe. And at the end, when you get nothing, you want to come and complain. Well, what do you have when you have absolutely nothing? Salt. They say when you're hungry and there's nothing else, you just put some salt under your tongue and suck salt. And we had that whole idea of sucking salt as a condition for many, many people, as a perennial condition, is what we were expressing in our song. And in hindsight now,
Yeah.
That song was done 2 years after the book Salt was published, and I know I would have read Salt somewhere in that time. But when it's time to make a song, you're not thinking of a big theory. You get that expression, salt, nothing for you, and you like it. If you read, reading Salt just the other day for this in preparation for this talk, the reparation thing was like jumping out so much clearer to me now, because my brain is way more open to that now. Now's the time. The time is now,
Yeah. And it's funny that you're saying that the reparation, aspect was jumping out more at you, because I did want us to discuss that as well, because that's exactly the same experience I had. And I felt I was, it's funny when you go back to a novel after many years, and then it's like a new novel in some ways, because you're seeing so many things you didn't see before. And just to go back to your earlier point, this is not to critique those who do leave. And that's very, very important, because
absolutely,
flight
wholeheartedly,
is not necessarily just a failure. It is a reality. But I think what Lovelace is talking about and is insisting on is, well, what about those who ate salt and stayed back? Right, that there's this connection to the land, the specific land. However much we can expand the Caribbean, all across the world, the presence of the Caribbean, through migration and so on. What about the specificity of the land? And that's where we can come to reparation in just a sec. But I did want to say, it's funny, as I was listening to you talking about salt, I thought about sugar and the way in which sugar has played so much of a role, of course, because of plantation slavery. With the same kind of resonance of, on the one hand, absolute brutality, and needing to fly, but on the other hand, also the sweetness of life. That is always there, regardless of the brutal past and even deplorable living conditions,
And that's the thing, it's like you recognize it's all in the mix. It's not this or that. It's all in a piece. The horror was there alongside all the exuberance, alongside all the oppression, alongside all the expression.
Yeah. So I wonder if we can, get to this issue of reparation. I have to confess that, at least in the article that I wrote, I was not fully prepared to figure out where the reparation, debate was going. So just to sort of refresh our memories, for those who may not, and for those who may not have read the novel, the whole point is Bango trying to get his plot of land, and insisting that this is not a giveaway, that this is an unpaid debt that, the government owes him. And this goes all the way back, of course, to reparations for slavery. Not just the current sense of it, because he's speaking as somebody who carries this legacy of slavery, not with shame, but with pride.
Absolute pride.
That I have labored, I own the land through my labor. And so we go all the way back to the early petitions to the Queen that are represented in italics. You owe us. What are we getting paid? The planters are the ones who are getting paid for emancipation, and the fact that they are losing their labor. But what about us? So I did want to, I mentioned this particular DVD that I was watching, The Price of Memory. It was very interesting to see it in the context of Jamaica and that ongoing dialogue there, because there what was foregrounded were the Rastas, and the Rastafari did not eat salt. And so there was not just reparation, there was repatriation.
Repatriation,
also wanted to go back to Africa, and then the complexity of that, where to go, who will embrace them, what about land, what about education, what about infrastructure. So I was curious not just about the question of reparation and what it means in the novel here, but also the fact that Lovelace kind of decouples repatriation and reparation. He's really not that interested in the flight back to Africa.
Yeah. And I guess because the people that he was describing, they weren't interested in it per se. I think the description of that, the idea of repatriation with one's Black identities is grounded in Marcus Garveyism and manifests very much so in Rastafari. And Trinidad is a different construct, a different vibration at the core of it. And I think the whole idea, as you say, about his question about, well, what about people who choose to stay here? You know, that choice to stay here is a pretty solid choice. It's not a choice people, I personally haven't encountered or have encountered many people who are keen to go back to Africa as a principle. You know, a lot of people might be keen to leave and go elsewhere and seek more opportunity. Although there's been a burgeoning Black consciousness and an African consciousness, it's living it right here. It's not like trying to go somewhere else to do that. So for me, it's like a reignition of a Pan-African consciousness, so that the African vibration exists on the ground across the waters, across the island chains, all through South America, all where the island people and the African people and people of color and people of brown skin people with their rhythms and their vibrations, you know, that consciousness is there, here, living it, and is to claim it, is to re-invoke it, is to reaffirm it, is to understand what that is, because part of it has been a conscious unknowing. There's a lot of shame, there's a lot of notions about, you know, and ability to value certain qualities and not see them as shiftlessness or laziness or what have you. To value expressions like dance and the innovation, you know, at every turn of oppression, we come up with something new as a response to oppression. And one of the things I think within recent times as well, with no overt oppressor, you know, are we still able to come up with things on our own, you know, without that response to oppression? So it's like, you look at, we innovate and we develop and we create new things, and they stop beating the drums, so we make the tambour bamboo and we create adoption and all those things. And then the bamboo didn't cure, so we make a pan, and then after a while we get free. So everybody just happy and jumping up and pappy showing themselves, you know.
Well, there's, as I said, there's always that risk in some ways, and again, the risk is also holds potential of liberation. You know, a pappy show can also be liberatory. It can also be a critical
You
space.
see, it's like when you look through, when you see through what's being offered to you, you know, in terms of governance and administration, people say, you know what, I live in a real life anyway. You know, it's like, you know, I may carry on with my life, and even though they still get caught up when it's time to vote in that part of it, you know, along tribal lines or not questioning anything, and then the mass really amplifies to a whole other degree. But at the end of the day, it is a debilitating condition. So it requires being able to look at it critically, you know, to say, yeah, we love a good mass, but it don't have to be a pappy show. That, you know, when it comes to governance, we can't be resisting our own self, you know, and then working out what that self is, you know. And so much of Lovelace's work about, especially the male characters, that sense, that self, you know, finding that self in the world is a big imperative, you know. Whether it's Dixon in his fancy shoes, digging and digging and digging till the blisters come, but he wouldn't stop digging because people needed to perceive him in a certain way. And, you know, that you were talking about Bango's insistence, right? His pride, his great pride in his story, you know. And that's I look at Bango and I say, but, you know, Bango know his story, and Bango's story goes back a couple generations. Many of us here, our stories stop after a generation and a half. We really are like the newest people in this part of the world, you know. In Trinidad, people came from all over the place.
That's right.
And they came with all kinds of piece of stories, as Walter called fragments, you know. So Trinidad is particularly challenging and intriguing in that way. But back to Bango is because, knowing his story, he felt right in his claim. Because it wasn't about him getting through with a piece of land, it was about a symbolic recognition of a past wrong and an attempt to right that wrong, and an attempt at some kind of healing, and you know, putting him on an equal footing with the other players. And Alfred's decision to go through with it was very brave and very risky and detrimental in the end. So it shows stakes are high in this regard, you know. And of course, we could always look at Bango as another madman putting on this mass every year. You know, his poor wife was like, you know, please stop.
Yeah, that's what I meant by, you know, a pappy show can be liberatory. In other words, these are performances, these are marches, these are demonstrations, you know, and for Loveless, I think the activist potential of performance is always very close at hand.
But I also see it in our real life when he captures, because it's there in our real life, and which is what he captures beautifully. It's not like you don't believe these characters. They're very credible. They're very, very credible characters, and they reading it again this time forces you to see yourself, the many characters and the many oddballs that make up the story of our life in this space, you know. And as I say, Bango has the knowledge of the how many great grandfathers that took flight, and down the generations, he understood why he was holding out and what he was holding out for. Many of us don't even have that grounding.
Yeah, that sense of an oral history, you know, that relates through the different chapters. And it's so interesting that Loveless has chapters like so-and-so story, so-and-so story, you know, and the linking of these stories of these individual characters that ultimately kind of lays out Trinidadian history, you know, not just strict history as such, but from a very imaginative point of view, where sometimes you have to go back into the past and think about what Bango's, you know, great-great-grandfather went through, for instance, and then you come all the way back down to why Bango seems to echo that need, right? I need my land, give me my land. That was first.
For me, that's what's so powerful in Salt, you know, that he was able to insert the history into the stories and pull the stories out of the history and make it and do what I call booming up history. You know, that's a term we use in rap. So, you know, we come to boom up history. We come to make it accessible. We come to make people understand how we come to be operating and performing and responding to things the way we do, because of factors things that happened, you know, and can echo, as you say, down to this day.
That's right. Because there are certain scenes that are repeated, you know. Yeah. So when Jojo goes and finds an Indian indentured labor, for instance, on the land, and he says, what are you doing here? Don't you understand that people are living here? And he tells him, but I bought the land. And he's so shocked because, of course, there's been no option for him to buy the land. The same thing happens later on with Bango going and saying, what are you doing? You know, we live here. And the Indian again saying, and we'll come to that whole notion of the East Indians when we talk about reparation, because there are some inter-ethnic and interracial tensions.
I like how you say some.
You know? Yes, when we talk about party politics tied to, you know, tied to ethnic and racial identity, that clearly disturbs Loveless in many ways, even though he understands where it's coming from. You know, I just wanted to go back to an earlier point of yours to emphasize that when you think about notions of flight, it's not just to England or to the global north, as they call it, right? But also to Africa that Loveless is dealing with here. The flying back to Africa and then the flight towards England in this particular case. And it's interesting that you're saying, well, the discourse of repatriation is not that prominent here. It's, you know, it's our own sense of what we make of Africa right here. And I think that's so important because when you think about the traditions that he invokes in the Dragon Khan dance, so many of them are sacred masking traditions from Africa. You know, it's not like he lays them out there with a sense of, here you go, I've done the scholarship. It's just little echoes that keep popping up that evokes that tradition. But ultimately, he's about what Trinidadians have made of, you know, all the different continents that have contributed to life in Trinidad.
And that's why I say it's part of our living reality, but you know, the fresh eyes, the ability to see it as valuable is what we're talking about, because that's been challenged by our education, and that's been challenged by another aspect of our living reality, which is, you know, getting through and hyperconsumption and a certain selfishness and not trusting the system and finding the ins and outs. So this culture, this folk culture, this, culture that harks back from Mother Africa and Mother India and everything else that feeds us and sustains us, is in steady competition with what our living reality is in many regards. And in many ways, as I say, it may look like, but it's not making sense. And that's one of the challenges we face every day, for things to make sense. But things are happening all the same. How do you respond to them?
Yeah, in fact, doesn't it? That's what the whole notion of the welcome is, right? Which is, here we have this mix of populations that have different experiences of colonialism and slavery and indentured servitude. How do we now live together? How do we share on this island? How do we not? Because when you talk about this ownership of land, it's not about private property for him. It really is the question of, saying, look, here's what you owe my ancestors and owe me because of the centuries of unpaid labor that we have contributed.
His cause was the fact, and I've done this as an exercise. I'd say to some of the, because I teach and inveigle young people to think a lot, and I'd say let's imagine emancipation as a moment, right? Put yourself in it. What do you think happened? Well, we were free. All right, yeah, we were free. And then what? What do you mean? Well, we were free now? I said, well, not emancipation. People were compensated. Who do you think was compensated? And they were like, what? Well, they get money? But they're thinking the recently freed people got money. It's like, no, the people who lost their labor were compensated. And I've seen people react like in horror, in shock, just on not knowing, and I say, one of the things that we have to constantly acknowledge is that we really do not know our history. And that Bango's harping on the fact that on the moment of emancipation, even if I wanted to buy a piece of land, I couldn't because it had to be 80 acres or 40 acres or some humongous amount that no recently free, black man would ever be able to buy. And he decided, what the people responded by leaving the estate, squatting, going in the bush, going Laventee, setting up in the urban areas and creating that whole crucible of culture in town, as I like to call it, separate and apart from the plantation. But he decided he's going to base himself on this plantation symbolically until he get what his great-great-great-great-grandfather deserved as repatriation for that big void that was left unaddressed. And just as you say, the first time I read Salt, I was struck by that first encounter between the African and the Indian and how it happened. Is like, somebody swiping the grass, what is that? And the casualness of, well, I own this land. And like, after all these years that I waiting here trying to figure out, and you just own the land? So think about what happened after that, not antagonism, not bacchanal, not confusion, and that bacchanal and antagonism has been fed from that moment to this present moment.
Yeah.
So in reading these things, you can now uncouple yourself from all kind of knee-jerk responses and reactions. You could actually see, but wait now, look at how this thing happened, and then look at the consequence of this, and then look how this might have played out. And you could reframe that, and that's for me what consciousness is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So writers like Lovelace in Salt is a grand, very ambitious undertaking, but he manages to do it because he makes it human and real. Bango's quest is not grand, it's real.
Yes.
And his demand that it be treated with a certain amount of respect came across in some people's eyes as presumptuous. Who is he? Knowing your place is a big part of our story, Well, Bango knew his place, but his perception of his place and other people's perception of his place are two completely different things.
Yeah. That was the most powerful part of the novel for me, rereading it. The way in which history kind of comes alive. Because one of the things I think the questions that may be raised here, and indeed are raised in the novel, is why on earth are you hopping back to a past that goes, so far back? Why do you want to bring up slavery again? The prime minister says, oh, he's breeding hate and envy and resentment. It's going to pit one constituency against another, one group against another. Who's going to give who what? That whole question of rivalry, which is not what it's all about. And if I can just speak from the perspective of somebody in the United States, for instance, and the question of racial solidarity, for the longest time, brown people didn't necessarily ally themselves with black people here. And the George Floyd moment was a huge moment for them to understand, gosh, this is what has been going on here. I don't know why it took that long and that particular episode to suddenly make everyone begins to see themselves as, how important it is to talk about solidarity.
Yeah.
That it's not rivalry, it's solidarity. And I think that's what's being worked out in the novel when Caliban, Sonan, Kenneth, or whether Indian or French Creole or whoever are all saying, well, what is important about Bango's quest here that we all need to share?
And the thing is, they couldn't fathom it. They could not, for whatever, shortcomings, what it represented, they all had to say, well, no, I can't fathom this because it's radical. It's redressing something that should have been addressed so long is like impossible to address at this stage, but address it we must because it continues to inform us.
Yes.
It continues to be part of our story.
That's right.
Owning a piece of land. Something interesting when I think about characters like Bango and their recall of their story so far back. I was part many moons ago of something called World Youth Service Enterprise. And as a 20-something-year-old, I was put together in a group of other 20-something-year-olds from India, Sri Lanka, Russia, Brazil, the United States, whatever. One of those things where they identify young potential world leaders. Don't ask me how. I thought it was a theater camp. But we did an exercise one day where we were asked to go back in time in increments, 15 years or 25 years, 50 years, 100 years. Well, as a Trinidadian, I kind of fell off the cliff after 100 years. And the people in India and Russia, and they were good. They could go back and back and back and back and back. And that struck me under that sense of how new I was, how ignorant I was of, you hear that your grandmother come from Grenada and your grandfather come from Tobago and your next grandfather come from Venezuela and your grandmother come from St. Vincent and your great-grandmother is a Garifuna. And you don't hear that in one coherent stream, and you just pick that up along the way. And then you realize you're kind of new and you're in this place called Belmont. It's this hurly-burly of a place called Belmont in the 1970s and Black Power days and all that kind of thing. With a mass camp next door and a panyard up the road and a theater down the road and all these vibrations, And then next thing, boom, you're off to St. Mary's College. But who are you? Where are you in space and time? And you figure that out over time through our stories, through our characterizations, through the longest ritual thing that we have going on, which is the carnival. I mean, if we have to start from somewhere, we have to start from somewhere. And inside those carnival forms, just as you say, is all the traditions from the mystery schools of Africa, but it have plenty Indian thing and plenty Chinese thing and plenty Amerindian thing. And it's not a monolith.
Yeah. I'm seeing two questions here, and I'll get to that in just a sec, but I want to go back to this question of accountability and reckoning. That's really what it is, because when Tony Blair acknowledged, during the bicentennial of the abolition of slavery, he gave a formal statement of he gave a statement of regret, expressed shame over slavery, but there was no apology.
Yeah.
No formal apology. And of course, when you look at the price of memory, the Queen's response to those who petitioned her, those even sued her, was to say, at that time, slavery was not a crime. And therefore, it's not really a crime against humanity. And there are all kinds of legal implications which are beautifully brought out in the price of memory. But I thought that was significant, right? I mean, Barbados is just going to become a republic now. They've asked the Queen to the Queen is going to drop as the head of state. I mean, imagine if for anyone who wants to know why are we still talking about these issues now, that's why we are still talking about these.
Exactly.
Issues.
Yeah.
Empire has not gone away. But I'm going to answer Janine and Erica the question in the way I see it, and then I'll pass it on to Wendell. when I think about both who are we and who am I, as Wendell was saying, it's really stunning how the younger generation and even us, we don't really know these particular historical, issues. And so we are puzzled about why these tensions are arising. Even Naipaul, when you think about it, most of his angst was about how he didn't know where he came from and who his ancestors were. So there's that sense of discovering yourself and your community. But then Lovelace is always aware of tensions between communities. So there's one agenda, I feel, which is about a certain kind of self-discovery. So Black consciousness is very important to him. But there's also another agenda, which is relational, which is who am I in relation to other people?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's our, once again, to use the phrase I've been using, our living reality demands that of us. We can't just be who we are in definition of self in abstraction. No, we live in a polyglot. We live in a rambunctious, place where we all are under one another, and none shall escape, as I like to say in one of our songs. We can't get away from it. We like one another expressions, and we like lots of things about each other, but we also have ideas about each other that, because of our ignorance of our history and our stories, continue to be fed and perpetuated. And I think that one of the ways to counteract that is to each one to familiarize ourselves with our stories and appreciate each other's story.
Yes.
And I may be naive in that regard, but I think that's the power of storytelling. That's why we have storytellers. That's why we have fellas like Earl who choose to live here and chronicle us and I like to use the word represent us to ourselves. And whoever has to see will see, and whoever has to hear will hear. And over the years, I've come to take more and more from him and put it in my work, which has a different form, which is maybe a more popular form in the mass and performance and making shows for Carnival, and putting some of the questions he asks inside some of those shows, when he asks, what about the ordinary people? What have we done with what they have done? What have we done with their love? I mean, that hit me upside the head all kinds of ways, and took me back to my mother and father, and what am I doing with what they have done, and what have I done with all those things that I was exposed to as a youth, and try to challenge young people to come and say, hey, look at this thing. These are our forms, these are our expressions, Let me dig up in them for a minute.
Yeah.
Earl Lovelace's passage from Dragon, when he celebrates the hill, I was doing some work with, young people from Laventille and East Port of Spain. And I would always give them that passage to read, and you could see a complete difference. There's this in a book, they are in a book, beautifully written about in a way that they could understand. And it's funny when, the guy is being pelted with the stones and he loses his temper and tell them not to pelt him with small stones, pelt him with instead of these big stones, But the idea of seeing themselves in a book or their story in a book is a very powerful thing for some of those people that it still echoes to this day, We were shooting a scene for a documentary I was doing about Port of Spain that was written about, and we went to Calvary Hill and they had a dragon, and these youth men from Calvary Hill showed up and they were like, hey, what music video is this? And I said, no, it's not a music video, it's a documentary on novels and books and stories about us, and it's a story about Calvary Hill. And they were like, wow, where can I get this story? I'm sure those guys wouldn't have been looking for stories otherwise, until they walking up the road in the middle of a hot Saturday and see a dragon dancing in the road and a film crew, and it's all because of Loveless and his vision and his ability to deploy art to take us beyond, because that's the role of art and story, to take us beyond,
I love what you're saying, Wendell, because in some senses you're talking about a multimedia conversation, right? What comes out of literature then moves into music. What comes out of music then moves into literature. They both infuse each other and inspire each other. And I want to get back to that notion of relation as well, because of course it's when I think about relation now, we think about Edward Glissant and Poetics of Relation, because he's another intellectual who's very, very interested in forging a Caribbean sense of identity, but also seeing it in relationship to others. One is never isolated. And I think that two prongs is really important, right? That to a certain extent, we do have to understand who we are and where we come from, but we can't box ourselves into our identities, right? We have to, in fact, share. And so I'm looking at this is from your bio, that you were baffled by the question why Black culture is important to you. It's not just important to you, you say it is fundamental to your understanding of who you are. And I love that, because when I think about Black consciousness, to me, people often ask me, how come you work so much on Black fiction and Black studies? And I always have to tell them, because that's how my mind got decolonized. It was essentially first reading Frantz Fanon and Ngugi wa Thiong'o that my mind simply exploded. That's what started me off on decolonization. So the way in which, Black consciousness was not just inspiring to Black people, the way Black consciousness, like movements here, the civil rights movements here, is inspiring to so many people, across races and ethnicities.
And, the thing is, I was like my off-the-cuff response, but then you realize that even inside of that sense of, and because for me it was rooted in the mass and that sort of thing, but there were huge gaps. There was, there were huge voices, there were huge biases and prejudices that have been planted in you, the whole, Orisha and Obia and all those sort of things. And as a red man from Belmont, there was all that sort of hues and tones and shadisms and, and what one was encouraged to aspire to, there's all kinds of Black consciousness, as I say. But for me, the idea of my Black consciousness was actively defined and refined in relation to the music and the art and our expression through the mass and those sort of things. For me, that's where the power of Black imagination and that's where the fire raged, after the Mardi Gras on the Camberley moment, boom, the whole thing ignite, and it gave birth to all kind of thing that we bring back from Africa, that we bring from India, that rise up from the Amerindian past. And for me, that's where, so much of my exploration and tapping into the power of my Black consciousness comes from, our expression, and my appreciation of our expression. But inside our expression,
that's where it comes from for Loveless too, right? When you think about it, there's so much of an emphasis on art, on music, on literature. In fact, he's quite suspicious, I feel, of party politics. And so, when Black power becomes sort of politicized in certain ways, he's very suspicious of it. When Black power is something that's imaginative and embraces and that is radical in ways in which it transforms your sense of who you are, and then you share it with other people, then it's something he seems to be really thrilled by. There's never something essentialist or rigid for him.
No, and because this space is not essentialist or rigid in that regard, it's hard to maintain that hard rigidity in a space that demands that so what, you're going to deny this? Reality is right in front of your face, You could be as bigoted as you want to be, but you're lining up for roti and doubles and whatnot. I can't imagine being a Trinidadian without roti and doubles or watching Indian movies on a Sunday, because that's what you grew up doing. But still we will cuss one another when it comes to time to vote, And make that make sense. But that's where we've been stuck in many regards. But in many other regards, we have a healthy regard and appreciation of each other. There's a huge amount of things overlapping and cross-fertilizing. I was always struck by the fact that you can't tell a Baptist flag from a Hindu flag in some communities. When you're seeing the living manifestation of belief and faith alongside each other. And you'd have people who's Hindu and Baptist, same time, deny that. No, you can't deny that. It's in the music. The music, not asking permission to mix up and fuse. It's the law of entrainment. Two strong rhythms side by side. They're not going to waste time. They're going to find a way to vibrate together. And our politics and keeping up with the living vibration in many regards, you know. And that's how I look at it. And Earl is able to encapsulate that beautifully time after time.
Yeah. I love the way you're putting it, you know, that we have to learn to vibrate together. And this question of, you know, working alongside.
Well, yeah, because I mean, it's a small place, back to the dot, right? It's a small place. So you have no set of room for you go and live over there and I go and live over here. No, we living in, you know, historically we've been kept plantation and port, urban and rural. We have all these divisions, you know, and then inside of all those divisions, it have all kind of hierarchical divisions. But you know, when we pull back, you know, it's strong elements that can't help but vibrate, and you can't deny this one and that one and choose this one over that one, you know.
They make music together. They make beautiful music together.
Yeah, make it make sense and manage it to the best so that, you know, of everybody. I mean, there are lots of deep hurts and deep grievances, and I think once again that's because of the not knowing or the stories that we've inherited that could be reaffirmed or counteracted by other stories, or we could start seeing other stories alongside our stories.
And Erica, yes, you know, in fact, even before we went live, we were all talking about the music in Loveless's writings and the flow of the words. And I actually had a passage highlighted, but of course we're out of time. But there's a marvelous passage in which, you know, you're looking out on the scene there, and it's all the throng of Trini folks with, you know, as you said, the rotis and, you know, the all kinds of people out there, and that sense of people making music and dance together. Now, I realize, of course, that it can become farcical because it is not all of these one necessarily. You know, there are all these tensions. But I think
but you see, we still have a good masquerade at the end of the day, a good jump up. Even if nothing changes, you know, radically, at least, you know, some of us would have had a good jump up at the idea that, you know, all of these one.
Yeah.
When you give up on it,
the musicality is there in Loveless's writing.
Yeah,
that's what, for me, you know, embodies Trinidad, the best of Trinidadian culture in his writing.
He has it down pat. He doesn't even have to try hard. It's like sometimes he has to restrain himself because when it starts to flow, it's flowing, and it's like, let's get on your horse and ride, you know. But there are times I say in reading Saul is like, who's talking? When did the narrator switch? But that's all part of, you know, the confusing complexity of the space in many ways.
Well, you know, I remember Sandra Pushe-Paquet saying about Lamming's novels that sometimes the actual village has a voice, and that it's hard to identify a singular voice. And I felt that in Salt as well. I think there's a reason why you don't quite know who the first person narrator is or the collective we is, because what he's trying to show is that there's a number of voices in here talking about musicality that merge and flow. It's not like he's trying to wipe away the tensions, but he's also trying to get that sense of the throng, of the voice of a crowd in some ways, where, you know, each character sort of fuses into each other as well. You know, because they all kind of learn from each other as they go on, and I think it's hopeful in the end that the novel ends with that march.
I think so. As I say, you know, not facetiously. If at the end of the day, you know, we come together and all these different vibrations coming down, and for a moment something happens. How do we capture that something and sustain that something? Not just the fun. I always tell people it's not fun. There's a joy.
Yes.
You know, I rather, you know, choose other words, you know. And I'm as an example, making music and traveling to the various diasporic carnivals, I was struck by the idea that 3 million people in New York, 2 million people in London, 1.5 million in Toronto, how many hundreds of thousands in Miami. And all of those things would have started with a few, I like to say facetiously, drunk Trinis who had enough and wanted to celebrate life the way they know how to celebrate life. And before you know it, they've taken over somebody's city for a day. and millions of people come out. What is that? I don't know what it is, but we've done it time, and we do it time and time again, you know? And that possibility is inherent in us, but also back to the beginning, flight, you know, Olive Senior says flight is the only way home in one of her poems, you know, Over the Roofs of the World. And Bango's flight back to Africa, and the Black and the Turan say, look at them, you see them, they go on and they didn't tell me how to go forward or go with him or whatever. And then the gang Sarah come in here and eating salt, and here we stick, and the Rastas realizing somewhere in their doctrine, do eat salt. That's the only way to get back to Africa. You have people will tell you, I ain't going back to Africa, I like to eat salt too much, you know, as a way of sort of settling in this place, you know.
Exactly, yes. And I think the title of the novel is therefore significant.
Very significant.
It names it so.
Yeah. Yes. A lot of people can't imagine not eating salt. So by default, they have chosen to live and operate in this place.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the beauty of a book like Salt, because I didn't have that thought in my head up until this discussion evolved the way it evolved, you know. Things start to make a kind of sense, you know. Imaginative, poetic, kind of, this making a kind of sense. There's something there. And that's why, you know, as we were saying earlier on, these issues are not stale dated. They remain current, they're recurrent. You know, the idea of the conversation around reparations and what form that should take, and what about repatriation, and how come he hasn't made a claim for repatriation, and does sense of self mean, you know, forget everybody else, or how do I be myself in the midst of everybody else being themselves, and try as you know, they say, to get along.
Yeah. I think Erica is supposed to come on. But Erica, feel free to come on because you're not interrupting us.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. This has been such a rich conversation.
Thank you.
So before you go, Supriya, I want to invite you to read something for us. Oh. You said they had a part to read because Wendell read for us.
Yes,
you know, so thank you. You will be honored.
Yeah, I would love to hear it.
I know. This has been so rich and thought-provoking, and
well, thank you once again for the opportunity. Thanks to, you know, the entire Black Consciousness Festival team and crew and community, and may it continue to grow from strength to strength, and may we ever continue to challenge our consciousness.
Yes, and you're part of the community now, eh? So once you say yes, we would let you go, so you're part of the community. So thank you for saying yes.
I'm here.
Good.
Here. So I'm going to end with this passage. This is the one I was thinking of. I just love it.
Yes.
Although it's kind of sarcastic about the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister. He's very distrustful of party politics, with good reason, I think. And so here it is. And he went into Woodford Square, where every 3 years he came to cheer up before the populace. I'm sorry, to tear up before the populace. There's an episode earlier when he's crying, so I thought it was tear here. But here it's tear up before the populace the invitations to professorships at universities from Berlin to Ife, because I have decided to let my bucket down right here among my people. He went into Woodford Square, walking through the grandest guard of honor ever assembled for anybody in this country, the line stretching from the single entrance to Frederick Street right up to the podium, the whole country gathered there. The place looking and smelling like Trinidad and Tobago, market women in shouters' headdress, smelling of red lavender and rose water, vendors of paratha rotis and ornaments, clapping hands and shaking tambourines, stevedores with flags in their huge fists and towels, draped over their formidable shoulders, nurses in grey stockings and starched apron uniforms, vagrants in their Sunday best, soapbox politicians with their fingers on their lips, choirs of school children, oyster vendors and sugarcane workers, and a contingent of supporters from the opposition parties. Yes, men in dhotis beating tasa drums and doing tabla, all of them standing together, and it goes on. It's a cascading rhythm of crowds and people, and it's just such a marvelous sense of seeing there.
It makes you want to be there, not so.
Yes,
Yes, and you can see it. It's so visual.
Atmosphere,
rich and
yeah.
visual. Yes.
And as I said, it's not overdone. I remember coming into town one time and arriving at a rally at Woodford Square and being aware of the crush, and you were sort of pulled into the rush of people heading to the square. It's very heady in the midst of all these moments. I mean, I was there as a skeptic, but it's a hell of a thing to watch people just lose themselves in it.
And he captures it so well. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So thank
So
you.
thank you
This
so
is
much.
wonderful, and thanks to the whole Black Consciousness Festival.
Thank you so much for saying yes. Thank you for being here, for honoring as we celebrate SALT and we celebrate Mr. Lovelace, still with us as Wendell and I
Mr.
said
Loveless,
earlier.
yes. Worthy of celebration.
Worthy of celebration, still with us. We thank you. We thank him. So
Supriya.
thanks again.
Thanks, Wendell.
A real pleasure.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank
Take
you.
care.